There are people out there who like to pretend video games were never political, and that political ideas being brought up in games is a new thing, and that it should stop. Occasionally, I might humour that line of thinking, but Just Cause is blatantly political, so I'm going to be spending some time talking about the game's politics. Those politics are bad, from basically every perspective. So if you're worried about listening to me throw shade at conservatism or something, then don't be. Just Cause is a 2006 third-person action-adventure game developed by Avalanche Studios that was released on PC, the original Xbox, and PlayStation 2, which was the version I played. The player is dropped into a mostly open environment and let loose on the general population. You can steal cars, steal boats, steal planes and helicopters. There's shooting with generous aiming mechanics, as well as all of the sex and drugs to be expected from a Grand Theft Auto clone. The fictional country of San Esperito has fallen into unrest, as a revolutionary force has risen up to overthrow President Salvador Mendoza. Amidst the chaos, an American spy agency deploys Rico Rodriguez to ensure Mendoza's regime is toppled, and to buy favor from the new administration, continuing an American tradition of shoving their explosive skydiver fingers into everyone else's governmental pies. When this stuff happens in real life, people are generally not too happy about it, especially the residents of the country that has earned the United States' attention. Such a setting would imply that Avalanche has some opinion about foreign intervention, that they would like to share in an action-packed video game form. Perhaps Just Cause exists to support this kind of political interference, or condemn it, or ridicule it. Reviews at the time were generally positive about the game, praising the skydiving and grappling hook mechanics, but any mention of Rico's narrative actions in San Esperito generally involved disinterest or confusion. The 2006 video game playing audience weren't ready to consider the USA's geopolitical actions in video game form. But, at the very least, we can hope something like the events of Just Cause couldn't ever happen in the real world. Anymore. The game opens with a news anchor reporting on a media release from the People's Revolutionary Army of San Esperito, in which the army calls Mendoza mean names. It then cuts to Rico preparing to skydive down to San Esperito while going over his assignment. There are a few shots of a dude in an orange shirt driving around, before he sets off a flare for Rico to aim for. Then the player gets hands-on with the skydiving mechanics, while Sheldon introduces himself. This section is basically the tutorial, and it does a great job of outlining the mechanical systems that will be at play within the rest of the game. The player parachutes a bit, then they shoot some guys with the guns that basically aim themselves, and then they're driven to the next objective while manning a turret to shoot at the enemies that don't really fight back. Other than the driving and the grappling hook, this is basically the peak of all of these mechanics too. Sheldon pulls up at a hut in the forest so Rico can meet and be slapped by Kane, before being told that the next part of the mission will be briefed in the nearby RV. What follows is a series of missions in which Sheldon and Kane point at targets for Rico to hit, and then Rico goes out and hits those targets in whatever method he deems necessary, which is okay if a little bland. For now, the player can rearm and get familiar with the game's underwhelming presentation. By 2006 standards, this game is plain. The entirety of San Esperito has the same grass texture and handful of trees. All the villages look the same. The small urban areas are all the same. And while all of the roadways do have different topography, it's hard to distinguish each one from the last. This is a big archipelago, with a surprisingly large population living on it too, so it wouldn't be unreasonable to have more varying geography in different locations. The weak presentation seems like something that could be attributed to hardware limitations. Sony's second home console wasn't exactly a piece of powerful tech at release, but Just Cause is like this on Xbox and home computer too. The game compares really poorly to San Andreas in terms of variety and recognizability as well. Anyone who played San Andreas for any amount of time will recognize the iconic cul-de-sac, but after 11 hours I don't think I'd be able to tell where Rico was from any screenshot of the game. Sonically, the game is serviceable. The gun and vehicle effects are decent, but the mix is pretty great.
Shit! They got Sams on the train! Keep your head down and your eyes open!
Wait, what? Follow the train, Rico! I can't shoot it. Or I can, maybe.
Okay, Rico, time to hear some bangs over there.
The way the music triggers whenever a big fight or chase breaks out is good, and it manages to not blow out the rest of the audio. But there aren't too many songs to apply to each scenario. Eventually, the coolness of the trumpet parts wears off, and then the music just fades away. The voice work is quality too. The performances might be a little bit cliched, but the script and actors did some really excellent work, with a lot of roundness in many of the voices.
Hey, come on, Rico. It's briefing time. Things are shaping up nice. Your new friend Carmona's already given us some nice intel. So, now we're gonna do a little surgery on the military. And guess who's the surgeon?
And while it was rare, I did find some NPCs interacting in an interesting way.
Drinking rum is my hobby, just like golf. I missed my mother's funeral because I was drunk. But then again, so was she. She wouldn't have minded.
I was a pato malo in my day. Now, not much of anything.
That was a bit... Unfortunately, the mediocrity of Just Cause's presentation is also indicative of the gameplay. As is the case in many other games of this style, the primary gameplay loop involves traveling to a location in a vehicle, and then shooting a bunch of people at that location until the mission parameters are reached. There's nothing inherently bad about missions like these, provided that the actual gameplay is enjoyable. But that's where Just Cause stumbles. Just Cause's vehicles control exactly like Grand Theft Auto cars, after all the tires are burst. The steering goes between horrific understeering until it hits a threshold where things transition to spinning out of control. Traveling anywhere by car is a tightrope walk through Fast and Furious one-liners, and the cinematic camera triggering whenever the vehicle's wheels leave the ground for a fraction of a second only makes the journeys take longer. Aquatic travel is usually preferable, since there are fewer obstacles, but the vehicles are similarly irritating to control. The aircraft control just fine, but they're very rare, so that luxury is reserved for only the end of the game. I find the choice to leave aircraft for the end a little strange, given that one of the game's primary mechanics is the skydiving. And what better way to engage that part of the game than by ejecting from a fighter jet just above ground level? Apparently not. Instead, the player will gain access to a fast travel helicopter from which to skydive and never pilot. The parachute controls are fine on their own, but there was no way the grapple hook parasailing was going to work well. Rico can break inertia and every other physics constant whenever he enters car surfing mode, but that flexibility isn't afforded to the parasailing. Unless the target vehicle is moving slowly and directly away, entering the parasailing state is kind of a crapshoot. Rico gains momentum and lifts off of the ground, but travels in the direction his legs were facing when he was standing. It ultimately amounts to another finicky and frustrating system that thankfully becomes redundant by the introduction of planes. Vehicle combat is also very lackluster, as it is easy to drive enemy vehicles off the road, or destroy them effortlessly on foot. The game seems to be banking on the player feeling like an unstoppable deity of destruction, as none of the enemy encounters ever really offer any kind of challenge. Squishy human enemies are all over the place, and they go down in a couple of shots, while anything mechanical can almost always be ignored, or simply blown up with any explosive. That being said, the combat systems aren't really built to accommodate a challenge. The guns aim themselves, so driving challenges are the only candidate for increasing difficulty, which would be horrific. Contextualizing the battles could have gone a long way toward making them satisfying though. Just Cause's actual narrative is super simple, but the implications of the events are just god-awful. President Mendoza's regime has been poor enough to inspire a revolutionary force to gather and begin fighting back. The president is apparently allowing a drug cartel to run the country while he focuses on staying in power. The Americans believe this means Mendoza has developed weapons of mass destruction, which is enough justification to assist the people's bloody revolution. First order of business is to break the rebel leader, Carabicas, out of prison in order to establish a relationship with the future head of state. Most of the rest of the game has Sheldon and Kane introduce some member of Mendoza's cabinet, or the cartel, for Rico to go and assassinate. But there are a few other tasks like destroying crops of coca or helping Carabicas gain access to a radio broadcasting facility so he can deliver a speech to the currently uninvolved citizens of San Espirito. After pushing Mendoza's forces back across the archipelago, Sheldon manages to locate a nuclear power station, as well as Mendoza's nuclear missile silos, confirming their suspicions. Due to the continued pressure, Mendoza does launch one missile at the United States, but Rico is able to intercept it before chasing the dictator onto his jet while in flight, and finally killing the president. Okay, so politics time. For those unaware, Operation Just Cause was the code name given to the United States military invasion of Panama during December of 1989. The CIA informant turned militarist dictator of Panama, General Manuel Noriega, had been assisting US intervention in El Salvador and Nicaragua during the 60s and 70s. But, like with most things, the relationship soured when Reagan gained office in 1981. Noriega's involvement in the scheme to arm the Contras in Nicaragua had earned him some bad press in the US, and Reagan asked him to step down. Noriega refused, and throughout Reagan's presidency, the Panamanian leader began looking to the Soviets, Cuba, and Libya for military aid against coup attempts from his own army. After Noriega overturned the results of an election, the US would have trouble accessing the Panama Canal, so the decision was made to invade. Upwards of 1,000 people died during the invasion, which was widely considered illegal under international law. It bears repeating. Noriega was on the CIA's payroll. He had basically been installed by them, and he was friendly with the United States until the Americans refused to acknowledge his legitimacy. This is where the video game's title comes from, as well as a great deal of content within the game. There were, and very likely still are, drug cartels active in Panama, fueled by the high prices their products are sold for in the US. American forces were frequently deployed in the region by parachuting out of helicopters, and naturally, much of the fighting was focused around airports and power stations. I don't think Avalanche Studios intended to glorify the events of the invasion, but I think their brazen approach to the gameplay and narrative events does belittle an actual military attack. The People's Army and Karamikas are portrayed as fairly ineffective, or incompetent without their American super soldier. But without the Americans' involvement, Mendoza wouldn't be in power. And after everything's over, when Mendoza is deposed and Karamikas takes power, will San Espirito be free to govern itself? Or will there need to be an American babysitting the country? Well, need. And the American characters in the game are always portrayed as treating this whole thing like a vacation. As if people aren't really being killed just over the next hill. Are these the people who are going to be running the country once Mendoza is out of the picture? Of course, there are other influences within the game. The Cuban Revolution is one. Cuba has been the subject to a lot of foreign interference throughout the past 600 years. But the instance in 1959 is possibly the most blatant example of the United States meddling in geopolitical affairs. Fidel Castro's communist revolution had been popular in the US, but after a string of executions and the repatriation of US-owned Cuban farmland, the relationship between the two countries collapsed. Economic sanctions and a few failed invasion attempts led to the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, that saw nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba being aimed towards the US. We see this influence in Just Cause's cover art, as well as a few events towards the end of the game. Appropriating the Che Guevara images for the cover is a bit strange in context, using Rico in Guevara's place when it really should be Karamikas. Guevara was not an American agent. His ideology was very much the antithesis of Rico's obedience to his imperial masters. And finally, to end this little rant, one of Sheldon's plans to help depose Mendoza is to blow up a nuclear power plant. Not only does this potentially cause a nuclear meltdown on a small island, which would irradiate a large portion of San Espirito's limited land space, but it also destroys a public utility that the people are still going to need. By that point, Mendoza and his forces had been pushed into a corner, making utility destruction little more than an act of terrorism and doing nothing to improve the People's Army's chances of victory. Avalanche doesn't seem to have demonstrated opinions one way or the other on the conflicts they've referred to in Just Cause. The enlightened centrists both siding a literal military invasion. Really poignant stuff. There was definitely an attitude of ignoring politics throughout the 2000s that makes Avalanche's decision to set Just Cause in such a tumultuous political environment kind of confusing. If they had something to say, any kind of commentary at all would be better than nothing. But then maybe the poor gameplay and environmental design were made that way deliberately to reflect the writing staff's inability to say anything of quality. Each facet of the game is a metaphor for how the writers refuse to take a stance on anything, culminating in an amorphous green blob of a game that wants to ride entirely on its grappling hook gimmick and putting Che Guevara on the cover. It's brilliant, really. Busting out an RTS classic next time.